So there's only three types of people in the world. There are the NPCs, or the completely ignorant, the non-player characters who are basically just floating through life in a space basically limited to survival mode. Then you have the masses of people in the middle who are basically subjected to the Hegelian dialectic, the dualistic mind control of the people who are controlling the narrative on a daily basis. The third set of people out there are the critical thinkers. The critical thinkers are usually the quiet ones, the ones who don't really engage in what's going on because they see the storylines for what they are. So they might even be living a very simple life, looking like they're in survival mode, but they're not subjected psychologically and consciously to survival mode. The mind controllers use this mentality of off and on, light and dark, hot and cold, because it's a very childlike way of thinking. It's a very simple-minded frame of existing. This is why cartoons at a very young age are so centered upon the good guy and the bad guy, the superhero and the villain, setting up the space of these are the good people and these are the bad people. Choose a side. There's nothing else. So subconsciously, when you get into adulthood, you start to see the world in the same light. And the same people, the same energy, the same controllers behind the storylines of the cartoons are controlling the mindset of the masses through the cartoons of the mainstream media. And the main phrases that are being used, instead of good and evil, superhero and villain, you're seeing pro this and anti that. It's the same storyline. The main intention is to control the dialogue. That is where the power is. The power lies where the attention goes. The attention goes to the dialogue. The dialogue fills the time. And as long as you can control the dialogue, you can control the time. And if you can control the time, you're controlling the velocity of the expansion of consciousness, individually and beyond. So that they referenced in the previous video, their main magic, their main manipulative tools are centered upon controlling the dialogue and maintaining the perspective of the Hegelian dialectic. So children who grow up wanting to be superheroes are in a sense anti-villain. They're anti-bad guy. And they're pro-superhero, pro-Superman. So when you become an adult, the dialogue now moves to anti-masker, anti-vaxxer, anti-abortion, anti-terrorism, anti-fascist. This is a well-known manipulative tool used by another group who pretty much made a business out of this, the so-called Jewish people. One of their defense mechanisms that were used, and they're a good example of how this system also uses the same kind of idea when they're saying things like anti-abortion, anti-terrorism, anti-this, anti-that, and pro-this and pro-that. The same magic works when the so-called Jewish people created the terminology of anti-Semite or anti-Semitism. Once you say anything that is threatening to the moves made by that group of people, they can automatically label you as anti-Semite, which makes them the superhero and you the villain. So like I said, to expand upon the use of the Hegelian dialectic, it's pretty simple. Create a villain, create a superhero. And you can start from either one. You can either start by creating the superhero by saying you're pro this or anti this because they're used interchangeably, or you can create the villain because either one is creating the other. So if you are anti-terrorism, then who's the bad guy? Well, the people who are pro-terrorism. And who are they telling you are the terrorists? All the other additions to that storyline are subconsciously and in many ways consciously attached. So now there's this persona of what a terrorist looks like. Why? Because they created this war on terrorism, and the mindset of the masses did the rest through the controlling of the narrative of the media. So like I said, the ignorant, the NPCs are just going to connect the dots, while the masses in the middle, who are following along the Hegelian dialectic storyline, are going to read the story and then regurgitate the story based upon where they see themselves in that storyline. There is no critical thought in Hegelian dialectic. There is no critical thought in the storylines that are used to control the narrative. This is why the anti-pro storyline has to be so vibrant, has to be so huge and so over the top. It's supposed to be attractive. It's supposed to be the cool crowd. See, in the larger storyline, when you compare the critical thinkers who don't even engage in the Hegelian dialectic, the comparison between that group and the Hegelian dialectic control measures, there's a Hegelian dialectic within the Hegelian dialectic of how they've labeled us. They use terms like conspiracy theorists. Oh, you're one of those guys, right? So it's a reprogramming of not even something limited to what you think about, but it's how you think. You're constantly in a space of thinking of a us and a them, a pro and an anti. And if that is all that is required to be a part of the cool crowd, then that's all you have to do to be part of the pro storyline. So overall, in all of these storylines, the people who are a part of the Hegelian dialectic put themselves in the position of pro, the same way the so-called Jewish people put themselves in the pro by putting you in the anti. If you say anything about the manipulative use of the mainstream media and how the so-called Jewish people are a part of that and have used that, you are anti-Semite, which puts them as the pro. They're the protagonist, you're the antagonist. So today we see this regularly with anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, pro-vaxxers, so on and so forth. And like I said, the main use of this mechanism is to control the dialogue, because in controlling the dialogue, you're controlling the time. And in controlling the time, you're controlling the contraction or expansion of consciousness, of thought, critical thought, of the masses in the middle. Another good example of how this mechanism works is people who are speaking about how they feel about the LGBTQ agenda being pushed in the mainstream media and how it's very obvious, and even speaking your mind on how you feel about that scenario. People label you as transphobic or homophobic. What this does is it cuts the entire dialogue down to nothing. You're wrong and there's no escaping that. It's a very childlike way of thinking, way of existing. And this childlike mentality is beneficial to the controllers, the they. Because like I said before, once you start to expand your consciousness, you can no longer think like a child anymore. You will start to get into a space of critical thought. And if you're getting into a space of critical thought, you will critically think yourself out of being controlled. So the intention of maintaining the Hegelian dialectic is to keep you emotional, keep you angry, or keep you happy, being that you're in a group of superheroes. You're on the right side. These sides are overemphasized by stacking the deck against you. So they put all of your celebrities, all of your comedians, all of your athletes, all of your higher thinkers, your scientists, your teachers, your narrators of the shows that you watch. All of these individuals are utilized as living superheroes. And just like I said before, if they can create a pro or an anti, they can create the opposite of that. So these celebrities, these politicians, these athletes, these millionaires are used to set the stage of who is a pro or who is an anti. And just like in a gladiator arena, they'll make it look like these pro and anti individuals are fighting in a fair fight. But the way the story is told, like I said, controlling the narrative, that's where the power is. The way the story is told, what they choose to pay attention to, that's what manipulates the people to think a certain way, to move a certain way. In this storyline, the critical thinkers have to be shut down, shut out, blacked out. This is why you see so much information being censored, so many people being pushed aside. The internet was created and all the information is shared across the internet. All of it is cataloged. Examples on YouTube. They can tell you what's important by the amount of subscribers an individual channel has, by the amount of views a channel has. By artificially controlling the numbers, they can control the attention. They can control the thought. They can control the velocity of time, the time it takes for that thought to go through time. And as long as the people are stuck in the clock, in the time frame of pro and anti, black and white, that storyline, off and on, hot and cold, as long as the masses are stuck in there, they won't allow themselves to critically think. Because the energy it takes to critically think will not be activated if the majority of your attention and your consciousness is sucked into the codes of a Hegelian dialectic. It's the same way that you can't really have an intelligent discussion with people who are overly emotional and are driven by their emotions, who literally will not allow themselves to critically think or rationally think about anything because they're too busy trying to egotistically or emotionally defend a particular position. The energy that would be used to critically think is being channeled into another format. So that format is the controlling of the dialogue, controlling the narrative. Because when you're a critical thinker, you can think about many different narratives and how they work interchangeably, how they work for a bigger picture. It's almost like a different dimension of thought. You have a one-dimensional thought process, the non-player character, ignorant automatons. Then you have the two-dimensional thinkers who are locked into a space of repetition off and on, good and bad, hot and cold. Then you have the third, fourth, and fifth dimensional thinkers who have more of a holistic approach to the system of thought itself, how thought works. Once you open up to a space of how thought works, there is no going back. You will no longer be controlled by outside sources. This is why the Hegelian dialectic, the good and the bad storyline, has to be maintained on such a childlike level on a regular basis. So if you find yourself caught up in a conversation or a back and forth with, or even using terms like anti-masker, anti-vaxxer, anti-terrorist, anti-fascist, anti-white, anti-abortion, anti-gun, anti-war, anti-climate change, homophobic, transphobic, if you're even in that storyline, you're in a space of being consumed by a thought instead of understanding how thought works. So even when you have people who question the moon landing, they're getting into the introduction of questioning the model of the universe altogether. Because why would they fake a moon landing? What good is that? Once you start asking and answering those questions, you're going to go down a whole nother storyline of, instead of what's going on and how that what was going on, but why what was going on and still is going on. So in that world of questioning, you have, and this term isn't used, but you have pro-globe earthers, which makes anybody else an anti-globe earther, otherwise known as a flat earther or infinite plane earther, whatever it is, whatever you subscribe to. And just being in that position of the righteous one, the superhero, the protagonist in this storyline. There's a sense of what turns into arrogance there, because you're already right. Because the ones who question what is already accepted within that two-dimensional thought cannot be seen completely. They cannot be understood completely because they're literally thinking in a different dimension of thought. So in order to maintain a solid foundation in their dimension, in their two-dimensional reality, in their two-dimensional belief system, they have to put you in some kind of box, in a two-dimensional box. And they'll call you crazy. They'll call you conspiracy theorists. They'll call you anti-everything, anti-education, anti-intellect, anti-American. This happens when so-called black people start talking about our own culture, just who we are. We've been called anti-white. We've been called anti-American. Why? Because when you think of American, which is including both North and South America, but when you think of American, what picture do you see? That's why these anti-American type labels are used, because those labels create an image. That image creates a reality, and that reality creates a group thought. That group thought is a power, because that group thought is held as a reality by a lot of people. And that reality doesn't even have to be true. It doesn't even have to be fact-checked by critical thinkers. In fact, they created fact-checkers to maintain the perspective of who's super right and who's super wrong, who's the super villain and who's the superhero. The fact checkers are like the Nick Fury in the Marvel universe. He finds the storylines of what the Avengers have to go fight for and attack. He knows about a collection of threats, of villains. And once these storylines are fact checked, then the Avengers, or the superhero masses, go out and do their work. They go out and attack. And just like creating the foundation for going to a war, the masses of people go into an intellectual battle. And when they lose that battle with themselves, they will default to whatever the masses are moving towards. And that's how this movement works. That's how this Hegelian dialectic control grid, this 1- and 2-dimensional mind control works. It's no different with this new identity called progressive thought, the progressive movement. Because once you see what's lumped in that group of progressive, it paints more clearly the picture of who is regressive. This is why the progressive movement came out when you had a regressive Trump in office. And that regressive thought being looped in with so-called conspiracy theorists. Because it's not about what they're talking about. It's just about you not being a part of the group that is right. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong. It's about the people who are controlling the narrative of what these people who are right and wrong are talking about. That's where the power is. The power lies in the storyline of what these progressive and regressive individuals are speaking on. Another outside control measure that is used within this storyline is even some of the critical thinkers are limiting themselves when they get caught up in the two-dimensional storylines by saying how much they're not part of the two-dimensional thought realm. One of the biggest traps that happens with these three-dimensional or critical thinkers is that they can get so consumed with breaking down the nonsense of the two-dimensional thought realm that most of their time and energy is spent in that two-dimensional thought realm instead of in a sense of critical thought. So the time that could be spent on a higher dimensional plane of thought is lost in a sense because it's wasted away by either guilting or shaming or analyzing the two-dimensional space forever, because there is no end. That storyline will continue to grow. There will always be something to talk about because it's like a rubber ball in a square box. A whole bunch of rubber balls being thrown around, bouncing all over the place. There's always going to be something in there to grab onto and talk about. And yes, you might be capable and existing outside of that box. But if your entire perspective is held within that box, you're really no different than the people who are consumed within that space, being bounced off these walls. So this is another part of the control measure that is being used also when information is censored. Because once you start to censor information, a lot of the critical thinkers will even avoid that information. Because another thing that can happen with the critical thinkers is that they can get consumed, since they're still in that three-dimensional space, they can get consumed by the ego. They get consumed by the attention. Because the praise of not being caught up in that two-dimensional thought realm creates another three-dimensional box. And the third-dimensional energy is downgraded to the two-dimensional space because they've emotionally accepted that addiction to that two-dimensional world turning. So they've chosen to stand as a giant, as a king in a world of little people. This is when you have critical thinkers who take advantage of their space, who take advantage of other people instead of challenging themselves to think beyond. So now they have become the progressives. They have become the superheroes in a higher dimension of thought. And since you're constantly having people break free out of that two-dimensional space and move on, you're going to constantly have a flow of people who will reinforce the space that you're at. They will reinforce the artificial throne that you have created for yourself. This is what the so-called they have done. They have generated this throne sitting on this identity of holier than thou humanity, the highest intellect of science, the scientific peaks of medicine, the intellectual peak of the university system, the sociological peak of Western civilization. All of this sitting on the foundation of Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution sitting on the foundation of the Big Bang. This storyline constantly growing on itself. They are the third-dimensional critical thinkers using that manipulative information to stand as giants, as kings in a world of little people. And maintaining the Hegelian dialectic, maintaining control of the narrative, is what maintains that little person dimension. And getting into the biology of your body is another way to keep you small. Just like getting into the psychology of your mind through the education system is another way of keeping you small. all these new things that are being mandated and enforced, pushed upon the masses, are just another way to maintain your smallness. And with the sharing of information, with the availability of information that's out there, the very nature of having the power to mandate anything on you adds more power to the overall storyline. The war on terror gave this system more power to reach its tentacles out into the world. These biological outbreaks are just another form of a war on terrorism being used for this system to reach its tentacles, not out into the world, but into your body and into the bodies of the future generations of your children. Not only for biological control, but overall control, psychologically giving that power over you to them. This is just another form of war. The physical war on terrorism was running out of steam. So the next war, to emphasize the power over you, had to be in-house. Not only in-house and literally in-house, but in-house around the world. These government mandates and so on and so forth are no different than what was deemed necessary after the Western civilization was convinced that they had to fight a war on terrorism. And who are the terrorists now? The anti-vaxxers, the anti-maskers, the transphobics, the anti-Americans, the regressives. Control the dialogue, control the time, control the consciousness, control the expansion of the dimension. And when you break out of those control measures, challenge yourself to move on.